The wind howled through the jagged cliffs, carrying with it the smell of pine and damp earth. High in the mountains, where the world seemed to pause and hold its breath, a girl's voice broke the silence. It was small, almost fragile, but the words struck like thunder. "Are you going to sell me like Papa?" she asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and raw, slicing through the quiet as if the mountain itself had gasped. The man beside her, broad-shouldered, weathered by years of hardship, his beard flecked with gray froze in place. His chest rose and fell as though he had forgotten how to breathe. Then, before he could stop it, tears rolled down his face, carving rivers into the dirt smeared on his cheeks. He hadn't expected her to ask that. Not here, not now. He had been strong all his life, strong enough to carry timber through blizzards, strong enough to fight wolves in the dead of winter, strong enough to survive when most men would have surrendered. But her words tore through him in a way no storm, no beast, no hunger ever could, because they were not just words. They were the echo of betrayal, the shadow of pain she should never have known. The girl was no more than 8 or 9, the eyes too old for her years, eyes that had seen more than they should have. She clutched the sleeves of her worn coat, the fabric patched and frayed, yet it could not hide the tremor in her hands. She had trusted him, followed him into the wilderness because he promised safety. But that question revealed something deeper: fear, mistrust. The scars left behind by a father who had treated her not as a child to be cherished, but as a burden to be traded. The mountain man sank to his knees, his strong frame folding as if under an invisible weight. He covered his face with calloused hands and his shoulders shook. He wanted to answer, to promise her that he would never, ever let her go, that he would protect her until his dying breath. But the words caught in his throat, because he remembered his own past, the choices he had made, the moments when desperation had almost driven him down the same dark path. The fire crackled weakly beside them, sending sparks into the night sky. The mountains loomed like silent witnesses, their snow-dusted peaks glowing faintly under the silver light of the moon. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, its cry echoing across the valley. But in that small camp, it was only the two of them, the girl and the man, locked in a silence that weighed more than words. He thought back to the day he had found her, standing barefoot by the river with tears staining her dirty face. She hadn't spoken at first, just looked at him with hollow eyes. He had offered her food, warmth, shelter. Slowly, she had followed him, step by step, until she trusted him enough to walk by his side. But trust, once broken, never healed easily. Her father's betrayal lingered in her heart like a scar that refused to fade. The man lowered his hands and looked at her. His eyes were red, his face raw with grief, but his voice, when it came, was soft. "No, child," he whispered, though his voice trembled. "Ever." Yet even as he said it, he feared she wouldn't believe him, because promises were easy. Living them was hard. The girl's gaze searched his face, as though weighing every word, every tear, every breath. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she turned her eyes to the fire, her expression unreadable. She pulled her knees to her chest and hugged them tightly, curling into herself as though bracing for pain that hadn't yet come. The man reached out. Slowly, carefully, his rough hand hovering above her small shoulder. He wanted to comfort her, to give her the security she deserved. But his hand lingered in the air, uncertain, before finally resting gently against her. She did not pull away, though she did not lean into him either. And in that fragile balance, the man felt both hope and despair. Hope, because she had not rejected him. Despair, because the road ahead would be long, filled with ghosts of the past, that neither of them could easily escape. The night deepened and the cold crept closer, biting through their thin blankets. The man added another log to the fire, watching the flames catch and flare. His thoughts churned, dragging him back into memories he wished he could bury, memories of choices made in hunger, of men who had traded lives for survival, of the unspoken truth that in desperate times even the purest hearts could be tempted. But looking at the girl, he knew one thing with certainty: he could not fail her, would not. Even if it meant breaking himself, even if it meant standing against the world. Still, the question lingered between them, unanswered in its depth. The girl's words were more than fear, they were a test. A plea for reassurance that life could be different, that not every man was like her father. And though he had given her his vow, only time would prove whether she could trust him, whether his tears were a sign of weakness or a promise of strength. As the fire crackled and the mountains whispered their secrets, the man stared into the flames, his heart heavy with determination. He had not asked for this responsibility, had not planned to carry another soul through the wilderness. No, but fate had placed her in his path, and now her life was tied to his. And yet somewhere in the shadows beyond the firelight, danger stirred. The mountains were never truly silent, never truly safe. There were men who still roamed these landsmen, who saw children as tools, as bargaining chips, something less than human. If they discovered the girl, if they learned she was under his protection, they would come. And when they did, he would be forced to prove whether his tears tonight were enough to steel his heart for the battles yet to come. The girl shifted slightly, glancing once more at him before lowering her head, to rest on her knees. Her voice, barely more than a whisper, reached him through the crackling fire. "I just don't want to be alone again." His chest tightened, and for the first time the man realized this was not just her story. It was his too. Two broken souls, cast aside by the world, now bound together by pain, by survival, by the chance of something greater. And as the firelight flickered against their faces, neither of them knew what awaited beyond the mountain ridge, whether safety, betrayal, or something darker still. But the girl's question remained echoing. In the silence of the night, shaping every step they would take from this moment forward. "Are you going to sell me like Papa?"
Ah!
The man closed his eyes, the weight of her words pressing into his very bones. The tears had stopped, but the battle within him had only just begun. And somewhere out there, unseen in the dark, the story that would test both of them was already unfolding. The night stretched long, the flames from the fire slowly dying down to glowing embers. The man stayed awake long after the girl had drifted into uneasy sleep, her small body curled tightly as though the mountains themselves might reach out and take her away. He sat with his back against a tree, staring into the fire, replaying her words again and again. "Are you going to sell me like Papa?" He could still hear the tremble in her voice, the fear woven through every syllable. It pierced deeper than the icy wind cutting across the valley. He had known hardship all his life, but something about the child's question unsettled him more than wolves in the night or blizzards that could bury a cabin hole. It was not just fear of losing her trust, it was the reflection it forced upon himself. He knew what men were capable of when desperation took hold. He had seen neighbors turn against neighbors for scraps, had watched families torn apart when hunger drove choices no one wanted to admit. He had walked that edge himself once, and though he had stepped back from it, the memory of temptation haunted him. The girl stirred in her sleep, mumbling something he could not quite make out. He reached to tuck the blanket more firmly around her, his hands careful, as if any sudden movement might shatter what fragile trust she had left. She reminded him of someone he used to know long ago, another child, another face that lived only in his memory now. But he pushed the thought away, forcing himself back to the present. Morning came slowly, first rays of light cutting across the peaks and spilling down into the valley below. The air was sharp and biting, turning each breath into a pale cloud. The girl woke with a start, her eyes wide, scanning the camp as if to make sure she was still there, still safe. The man pretended not to notice the fear in her movements, giving her space as she sat up and rubbed her eyes. He handed her a small piece of dried meat, watching as she accepted it cautiously, chewing in silence. She was thin, her frame too small for her age, and he wondered how long she had gone without steady meals before he found her. He didn't ask. He had learned that some stories revealed themselves in time, while others were better left to the silence as they packed up camp. The girl asked quietly, "Where are we going?" Her voice carried no trust, only a need to know. He hesitated before answering. "Somewhere safer," he said at last. It was all he could promise, though even he wasn't sure what safety meant anymore. They began their trek down the narrow trail, the ground still slick with frost. The mountains stretched endlessly around them, the ridges jagged like the teeth of some great beast. Every sound echoed the crunch of their boots on frozen ground, the rustle of branches above, the distant cry of a hawk circling high. The man kept his hand near the hatchet at his belt, not because of wild animals, but because of men. Out here, danger often wore a human face. The girl walked close, though she didn't hold his hand. She watched the trees, the cliffs, as if expecting someone or something to emerge. He realized she carried the same instinct he did, that wary sense of being hunted. Whatever her father had done, it had carved that awareness deep into her. As they walked, his thoughts drifted back to the day he had found her. It had been by chance, though sometimes he wondered if fate had a hand in it. He had gone to the river to check his traps, and seen her there, shivering, her clothes soaked through, her lips blue with cold. He had almost walked past. Years of solitude had made him wary of strangers. But something had made him stop, and when she finally raised her eyes to him, something in that gaze had broken him. He saw not just a child, but a reflection of every time he had been left behind in his own life. He never asked her full story, though pieces had slipped through. A father who promised safety, then betrayed her. A place she once called home, but could never return to. And that one question, "Are you going to sell me to?" She told him more about her past than any explanation could. By midday, the sun was high but weak, its warmth barely touching the ground. They stopped by a fallen log, the man pulling out a strip of bread to share. The girl ate quietly, her eyes scanning the tree line. After a long silence, she asked, "Why are you helping me?" Her voice was soft but steady this time. The man paused, unsure how to answer. He could tell her it was because it was the right thing to do. He could say he couldn't leave her out there alone. But the truth was heavier. He was helping her because in saving her, he might also save himself. He looked at her, the bread half raised in his hand, and said, "Because someone should." She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the honesty of his words, then nodded slowly. It wasn't trust yet, but it was something. The path ahead grew steeper, winding through thick pines. The air smelled of resin and damp earth, but beneath it lingered another scent: smoke. The man's steps slowed, his instincts sharpening. He raised a hand, signaling the girl to stop. She obeyed, her wide eyes watching him carefully. He crouched low, moving forward a few paces until he could see through the trees. Down below in a clearing, smoke curled from a campfire. Figures moved around it, men, rough-looking, their voices carrying faintly through the still air. The man's stomach tightened. He recognized their kind. Traitors, not the honest sort, but the kind who dealt in whatever they could get there. Hands-on, even people. He retreated back to the girl, his face set. "We'll take another path," he whispered. She didn't ask why, but he saw the way her hands clenched the fabric of her coat, her body tense with understanding. She knew what men like that could mean. They turned, moving carefully through the underbrush, away from the clearing. Every crack of a twig beneath their boots seemed louder than thunder. The man's heart beat hard, not from fear of discovery for himself, but for the child at his side. If those men saw her, if they learned she was alone but for him, they would not hesitate. By evening, they had put distance between themselves and the camp, though the unease lingered. The girl was quiet, her small face pale. The man wanted to tell her she was safe now, but he knew better than to offer false comfort. The mountains held too many secrets, and danger rarely stayed far behind. They made camp by a stream, the sound of rushing water masking the silence of the woods. The man built a fire quickly, his hands steady, though his thoughts were not. The girl sat close, her knees drawn up, staring into the flames. "Were those men like Papa?" she asked suddenly, her voice flat, almost emotionless. The man swallowed hard, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe worse," he admitted. Her eyes flickered with something he could not name: fear, anger, or perhaps just resignation. She nodded once, then turned her gaze back to the fire. The man sat across from her, the crackle of burning wood between them. He knew the road ahead would only grow harder. The mountains were unforgiving, and the men who roamed them even more so. And somewhere deep inside, he wondered how long before they were found. How long before the girl's question would be tested again. As night settled once more, the wind rose, carrying distant echoes through the valley. The man sat with his hand on the hatchet at his side, his eyes never leaving the dark beyond the freeheld, and though the girl finally drifted to sleep, her head resting on her arm, her words lingered in his mind, heavy as stone. He had promised her she would not be sold. But promises meant little in a world where survival demanded more than words. And as the shadows deepened around them, he could not shake the feeling that someone or something was already watching. The wind carried a low whistle through the valley, curling around the trees like a warning. The man sat close to the fire, sharpening his blade in slow, steady motions, while the girl dozed lightly beside the flames. Her sleep was never deep, never peaceful. Every crack in the woods made her stir, her eyes flicking open in fear before drifting shut again. The man saw it, though he pretended not to. He knew the look of someone who never felt safe, and it pained him more than the cold ever could. He thought again about the men they had seen near the clearing, traitors, smugglers, predators who thrived on weakness. Their presence meant danger wasn't far, and he wondered if they had already caught the faint trace of smoke from his fire, or the echo of their footsteps along the trail. He shifted closer to the girl, pulling another blanket over her shoulders. "Rest," he whispered, though he knew the words would not ease her. Rest was a luxury the mountains rarely allowed. By morning, the sky was heavy with clouds, gray and swollen with the threat of snow. They moved early, winding deeper into the wilderness, following narrow paths only those who lived in the mountains would recognize. The man had learned them long ago, back when solitude was his only companion. Now, with the child at his side, every turn carried weight. Every step was a choice between safety and risk. The girl walked quietly, her eyes scanning the horizon. After a long silence, she asked, "Why are those men here?" Her voice was small, but steady. The man glanced at her before answering. "Because the world down below doesn't give them enough. They come here to take what they want. Sometimes it's furs, sometimes it's worse." She didn't respond, but he saw her jaw tighten. He knew she understood more than most children her age ever should. Her father had shown her that truth too early, left her with scars that no mountain air could heal. Later, when they stopped by a stream to drink, the girl crouched by the water, staring at her reflection. "Do you think they'll find us?" she asked, not looking up. The man hesitated, then crouched beside her. "They might try, but I won't let them take you." His voice carried more weight than before, and though she didn't smile, she leaned a little closer, as if she wanted to believe him. That night, they reached the edge of an abandoned cabin tucked deep into the pines. The roof sagged and moss crept up the sides, but it offered shelter from the cold. The man checked the place carefully before bringing the girl inside. She ran her hand along the rough wooden wall, her eyes wide. "Did someone live here?" she asked. Once he replied. He didn't tell her the rest, that cabins like this often belonged to people who had vanished, swallowed by the mountains or taken by men who preyed on them. He set down his pack and started a small fire in the stone hearth, the crackle filling the quiet space. As the fire warmed the cabin, the girl curled up on a blanket in the corner, her eyes half closed. A man sat across from her, his thoughts heavy. He couldn't stay in one place for long, not with men roaming the forests, yet he couldn't keep moving forever. The child needed stability, and stability was something he hadn't known in years. While she slept, he remembered the world below the villages and towns he had long abandoned. He had seen what happened to children without protection, how quickly they were lost, how cruelly they were used. That was the conflict tearing at him now, to keep her in the wilderness where he could shield her, or risk leading her back to a world that had already betrayed her once, outside. The snow began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, covering the forest floor in white. The silence was almost complete, broken only by the distant snap of a branch. The man stiffened, listening. He moved to the window, peering into the trees. For a moment, he thought he saw a movement, a figure slipping between the shadows. His grip tightened on the handle of his hatchet. He stayed at the window until the snow thickened, hiding the forest beyond. When he finally turned back, the girl was awake, watching him with wide, questioning eyes. "Is someone out there?" she whispered. Maybe he answered, his voice low. He didn't lie, not to her. She deserved truth, even when it was hard. The next day, snowfall slowed, but the world was hushed beneath a heavy white blanket. They left the cabin at dawn, their boots crunching softly against the snow. The man kept his eyes on the trail, but his thoughts lingered on the figure he thought he'd seen. If someone was tracking them, it meant they were no longer moving alone. The girl asked no questions as they walked. She seemed to sense the tension in his silence, her own small face set with determination. At one point, she picked up a stick and carried it like a weapon, holding it close, as if it gave her some sense of power. The man almost smiled at the sight, though sorrow pulled at him too. No child should have to prepare for a fight. By afternoon, they came to a narrow gorge, the rocks slick with ice. The man crossed first, then turned to help the girl. She hesitated, her small boots slipping on the stone, but his strong hands steadied her. For a moment their eyes met, and he saw a flicker of something new in her gaze trust, fragile but growing. It gave him strength he didn't know he still had. As they climbed the other side, the man noticed fresh tracks in the snow, not animal, human. His chest tightened, crouched low, pressing his hand to the ground, studying the prints. More than one set, moving in the same direction they were heading. He stood slowly, his jaw clenched. The girl looked at him, waiting for an answer he didn't want to give. "We're not alone," he said finally. Her fingers gripped the stick tighter, her small face pale but determined. That night, they didn't light a fire. They huddled beneath blankets in the dark, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every crack, every whisper of wind through the trees felt sharper, more dangerous. The man lay awake, his hand resting on his weapon, his ears straining for signs of movement. Beside him, the girl whispered into the dark, "Do you think they're looking for me?" Her voice trembled, though she tried to keep it steady. He turned, his head toward her, his voice firm. "They're looking for both of us now." She was quiet for a long moment, then whispered, "Will you still keep me safe?" He didn't answer right away. His chest ached with the weight of her question. Finally, he said, "I'll do everything I can." And though the words were meant to reassure her, deep down he knew the truth. The mountains had their own will, and men who hunted them had their own greed. Keeping her safe would mean more than fighting off danger. It would mean facing his own past, the choices he once made, and the man he had become as the cold pressed in and the forest whispered around them. He realized the true conflict was only beginning, because protecting the girl wasn't just about shielding her from others. It was about proving to himself that he was different from the man who had abandoned her before. That was a battle he wasn't sure he could win. The night grew darker, and in the distance, a wolf howled. But beneath that cry, the man thought he heard something else, a voice, faint and human, carried on the wind. He froze, his heart pounding. The forest had gone too quiet. Even the sound of the river seemed muted, swallowed by the heavy air that pressed down on them. The man's instincts screamed at him, every muscle taut as he guided the girl along the narrow trail. Her small footsteps followed close behind, careful, almost soundless, as if she too sensed the danger pressing in from all sides. He had told her to stay close, and she obeyed without question, her eyes darting nervously at every shadow. By midday, the tracks in the snow were clearer, fresh. He counted at least 3 sets, heavy boot prints moving in their direction. The men were skilled enough to mask their trail, but the wilderness spoke to him in ways it never spoke to outsiders. Broken branches, disturbed frost, the faint smell of smoke carried on the wind, it all told him one thing. They were being hunted. The girl noticed his silence. Her voice hushed as she asked, "Are they close?" "Closer than I'd like," he answered. His voice was steady, but inside unease tightened his chest. He had faced men like this before, men who wanted something they had no right to. He knew how far they would go. As night fell, he didn't risk a fire. He crouched beneath the thick roots of a fallen tree, wrapped in their blankets, hidden in the dark. The girl leaned against him, her small frame trembling though she tried to stay strong. He kept his hand on his hatchet, his eyes fixed on the trees, listening. And then it came, the sound he had dreaded. Voices carried faintly through the night air. They were close. Too close. The girl stiffened, her breath catching. Lee placed a hand gently on her shoulder, urging her to stay quiet. The voices grew clearer, rough and careless, men laughing low in their throats. Words floated through the trees about a camp, about a girl, about a price. The man's jaw tightened. They weren't just passing through, they were looking. When the voices faded, swallowed again by the forest, he knew what had to be done. They couldn't keep running blindly. The men would catch up eventually. The mountains offered many paths, but only so much cover. He would have to choose, hide, confront, or risk leading the girl somewhere even more dangerous. The next day they climbed higher into the ridges. The snow deepened, slowing their steps, the cold biting at their faces. The girl struggled to keep up, but she never complained. Each time she stumbled, she pushed herself up again, her determination as fierce as his own. He admired her spirit even as worry gnawed at him. She was strong, yes, but she was still a child. They reached a cliffside by dusk, the valley stretching wide below them. Smoke curled faintly from a camp far beneath, too far to reach but close enough to see. The girl's eyes followed the smoke, her face pale. "Is that them?" she whispered. "Maybe," he said. He didn't tell her what he really thought that. It was almost certainly them, and that they were closing the distance each day. That night, the snowstorm came. The wind howled through the pines, shaking branches heavy with ice. They huddled in a shallow cave, the fire he dared to light flickering weakly against the stone. The girl pressed close to him, her face buried against his coat. For a brief moment, he let his arm wrap around her, offering what little comfort he could. But even here, even in the storm, he couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching from the dark. When dawn broke, the storm had left the world buried in white. They moved slowly, their steps sinking deep into the snow. It should have hidden their trail, but as he glanced back, he saw the truth-fresh prints followed theirs, not more than a few hours old. The tension grew with every step. The girl's silence was heavy, her wide eyes darting to him for reassurance he couldn't fully give. He wanted to tell her it would be all right, that they would find safety, but the words felt like lies on his tongue. By the third day, exhaustion weighed on them both. The girl stumbled more often now, her legs weak from the cold and the endless climb. At one point, she stopped, clutching her stick tightly, and said, "I can't go faster." Her voice cracked, not from defiance, but from fear of slowing him down. He crouched in front of her, his voice low but firm. "You're not slowing me down. You're why I'm still moving." He meant it. And for the first time, she let herself lean into him, her small frame trembling as he lifted her to her feet again. But as they pressed on, the sound came. A crack in the snow behind them, not an animal. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. He spun, his hand already on his weapon, eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, only silence, yet he knew they weren't alone anymore. The girl clutched his arm, her whispers sharp with panic. "They're here, aren't they?" He nodded once, his gaze hard. "Stay close. Don't let go of me." The forest seemed to close in, every shadow a threat, every whisper of wind carrying the echo of danger. They moved quickly, weaving through the trees, but the footsteps followed, sometimes faint, sometimes close enough to raise the hairs on the back of his neck. By nightfall, they found themselves cornered at the edge of another gorge. The drop below was steep, the river frozen into jagged ice. Across the gorge, the land rose steep again, but no bridge or path spanned the gap. The man's chest tightened. They had run out of road. Behind them, a branch snapped. The girl gasped softly, clinging to his coat. He turned, weapon drawn, the fire in his chest matching the pounding of his heart. Through the trees, figures moved, shadows at first, then shapes, rough men with heavy coats and hungry eyes. The girl's grip tightened on his arm. "Don't let them take me," she whispered, her voice breaking. He stepped in front of her, his body a shield, his weapon raised. The snow swirled around them, the gorge at his back, the men closing in from the trees. His breath steamed in the air, his eyes locked on theirs. The world held its breath in that moment, the mountains themselves silent, waiting. And as the first man stepped into the open, a cruel smile on his face, the man knew the time for running was over. The fight had come to them. The girl's question echoed again in his mind, louder than ever. "Are you going to sell me like Papa?" Gripped his weapon tighter, his heart burning with the answer he could only prove with action. The men moved closer, their boots crunching in the snow, their voices low and mocking. The girl clung to him, her fear palpable. The gorge stretched behind them, the trees full of enemies ahead. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. And then the first man lunged. Snow burst into the air as the first man lunged, his boots sinking deep while his arms swung wide. The mountain man moved quicker than his age should have allowed. His hatchet flashed once, a warning strike that forced the man back. The girl clung to the edge of his coat, her breath shallow, her eyes wide as she tried not to cry out. More figures stepped from the tree line, their faces hardened by hunger and greed. The man knew he was outnumbered, but he planted his boots firmly in the snow, the gorge yawning behind him. For a moment, no one moved. The men stared at him, calculating while he studied every detail, their knives, their rifles, the way they spread to flank him. He knew their type. Traders of misery. Men who saw a child not as someone to protect, but as a price to be bargained for. The girl's whispered plea echoed again in his mind, and for the first time in many years, he felt a fire inside him stronger than fear. The first blow came quick. One of the men swung a heavy branch, but the mountain man ducked low, slamming his shoulder into the attacker's chest. They both tumbled into the snow. The man's blade pressed hard against his opponent's arm before he shoved him back. Another rushed forward, and the mountain man's hatchet met the man's sleeve. Tearing cloth and forcing him to retreat with a curse, the girl crouched low, gripping her stick tight, her teeth clenched. She was trembling, but she didn't run. She stayed close, as though some part of her knew her place was beside him, no matter what came. The fight blurred into the sound of grunts, curses, the crunch of snow under boots. The mountain man's breath burned in his chest, his muscles straining, as he forced back each strike. Yet more men emerged from the shadows, and soon he knew the truth: they couldn't win by force alone. Survival here would demand more than strength, would demand resolve. When one of the men lunged too close, the girl did the unthinkable. She swung her stick with all the force her small frame could muster, striking the man across the leg. Staggered, surprised, and that one heartbeat of hesitation gave the mountain man time to send him sprawling into the snow. The girl gasped, shocked at her own action, but the man's eyes met hers with a fire of pride. For the first time, he saw not just fear in her, but courage. The standoff stretched longer until at last the leader stepped forward. His face was sharp, his eyes cold. "She's not yours," he said, his voice cutting through the cold. "Hand her over, and you can walk away." The mountain man's grip tightened on his hatchet. "She's not yours either," he growled. His voice was steady, the words carrying years of pain and defiance. "You'll have to go through me." Leader smirked, but something in the man's eyes made him pause. This was no desperate wanderer. This was someone who had nothing left to lose, and men like that were dangerous. The tension stretched until the snow itself seemed to hold still. Finally, with a sharp gesture, the leader called his men back. They lingered, muttering curses, but slowly retreated into the trees, their footsteps fading into the silence. The mountain man stood motionless until the last sound was gone. Only then did he lower his weapon, his shoulders heavy, his breath sharp in the cold. The girl stayed pressed against him, her eyes still wide, but when he turned to her, she nodded once. She understood. They spent the rest of the night in silence. Hidden in the shadows of the gorge, neither slept much. When dawn came, pale and gray, the man looked at the girl and saw the unspoken question in her eyes. Would the men come back? Would they ever be safe? He didn't have answers, not yet, but he knew what he could promise. "We keep moving," he said quietly. "Find a place where they can't follow." The girl nodded. She didn't ask where. She didn't ask how. She simply trusted him in that moment, and it was enough. Days turned into weeks as they pressed deeper into the mountains. The snow began to thaw slowly, streams breaking free from their icy prisons, the forest waking again. The girl grew stronger, her steps more certain, her eyes less haunted. She began to laugh sometimes, small bursts, rare and fleeting but real. She learned to start the fire when his hands were too stiff with cold to watch the tree line for deer or movement, to carry her own share of food. And slowly, the man changed too. Where once he had lived only for himself, now every choice he made was for her. She was no longer just a child he had found by chance. She had become his reason to endure, his tether to a humanity he thought he had long buried. One evening, as they rested by a river, the girl asked the question he had long expected. "Why didn't you leave me that day, when you found me?" He stared at the water, the fading light painting the surface in shades of gold. Because I saw myself," he said finally, "and because no one should be left behind." She was quiet, absorbing his words. Then, for the first time, she reached out and took his hand. It was a small gesture, but it carried more weight than anything else. Seasons shifted. Spring brought green back to the valleys, and with it, a chance for something like peace. The men who had hunted them never returned, or if they did, they couldn't trace their path through the wild ridges. The girl began to hum when she walked, her voice light and clear, a sound that filled the silence of the woods. The man listened. Each time, his heart steady, his burden lighter in time. They came to a small clearing where the mountains curved protectively around a stream and meadow. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The man built a shelter there, with the girl helping. Her hands clumsy, but eager. They planted what little seeds he had carried in his pack, tended the ground, and watched as the forest became less a place of hiding and more a home. The girl's fear never vanished entirely. Sometimes at night she would wake from dreams with tears in her eyes, whispers of her father's betrayal still clinging to her. Each time the man was there, steady and silent, reminding her with his presence that the past no longer had power over her. She was not alone, and she would never be sold. And though he never said it aloud, the man knew she had saved him too. Her question, painful as it was, had forced him to choose who he truly was. Not a man broken by his past, but someone capable of protecting, of caring, of being more than the shadows he had lived in years later. When the meadow bloomed each spring, the girl would smile, her laughter carrying across the stream. She grew into herself, strong and steady, her spirit unbroken. And the man, once hardened by solitude, found a peace he had thought was lost forever. The mountains had tested them, had pushed them to the edge of survival, but they had also given them something greater: trust, courage, and a bond stronger than blood. And though danger would always linger somewhere beyond the ridges, the man no longer feared what lay ahead. He had faced the worst of men, the weight of the past, and the question that once haunted him. "Are you going to sell me like Papa?" His answer had been written not in words, but in every step, every fight, every choice. And in the end, it was enough. The girl was safe. The man was no longer alone. And together, they carved a place in the wilderness where no one could take them apart again. The story ended not with the echo of fear, but with the quiet strength of survival, and the reminder that even in the harshest places, trust and love could still take root and grow.